once the name of the mother of King Minos and concubine to Zeus himself. Now, the name of a small icy moon orbiting the gas giant Jupiter. The celestial object has a core probably composed of iron and nickel, and a crust of silicate rock. Above the mineral crust, there's an ocean of briny liquid water, and above this, there's a moon-spanning shield of ice that could be as much as 100 kilometers thick. Europa has a faint trace of an atmosphere, composed of wisps of oxygen and hydrogen that sit at 0.1 micropascals in pressure, which is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of Earth's atmospheric pressure. Something on the order of 1 atmosphere times 10 to the power of negative 12. It's almost nothing. But it's still there. And the presence of oxygen there might be interesting if it were there from a biological source. But as far as we can tell, it's not. It's an abiotic process. Oxygen is pretty reactive. So if you have any material that can be oxidized on the surface of your planet, like iron or water, this will absorb the oxygen. This is why Mars is so red. A lot of the iron-containing minerals on the surface have been thoroughly oxidized. On Earth, we also have minerals that absorb oxygen and extract it from the atmosphere. The ocean does this to an extent as well. If there was nothing to replenish this oxygen that's getting absorbed by these oxygen sinks, then eventually, all of the oxygen would be gone. This is why seeing molecular oxygen on other planets and moons is pretty exciting, because it suggests that there's an ongoing process there that's producing oxygen, potentially like a life form that breathes it out, like plants. But on Europa, the oxygen is produced through purely physical, non-living processes. UV radiation from the sun and charged particles from Jupiter collide with the ice on Europa's surface and break down the water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen is light enough that it can be flung out into space, but the oxygen molecules are relatively heavy, and they bounce around within the gravity well. So this is what produces a very small, very thin, but persistent layer of oxygen on the surface of Europa. It's not from any potential alien life. But this doesn't mean that Europa is lifeless. Not at all. Gravity has a very interesting influence on Europa. The moon is tidally locked to Jupiter, and this has several consequences. Because the planet's icy shell is not attached to the mineral crust, because there's a giant subsurface liquid water ocean in between, the icy shell actually rotates relative to the core. Every 12,000 years, the icy shell of Europa completes one revolution around the rocky core. Jupiter's gravity flexes the icy crust, this icy shell, and this induces the formation of wrinkles and cracks in the ice on tectonic scales. This leads to the production of linnea, or massive orange-red lines that crisscross the moon's surface. These are the products of Jupiter's gravity warping the surface ice, creating giant seams and breaks that are analogous to deep ocean ridges here on Earth because of how they recycle water and ice on the surface. The linnea form along predictable stress patterns corresponding to the influence of Jupiter's gravity, and as the icy crust rotates through this 12,000-year cycle, the pattern of linnea is recreated at every new angle. So the linnea pattern is actually a recording of Jupiter's gravity influence on the moon over many millions of years. Now what's interesting about these linnea is that they're dark orange. They're like an orangish red. There's some geological hypotheses for the rusty color, and these include things like sulfuric acid hydrates or magnesium sulfate salts mixed with sulfurous compounds that are all being secreted out of the ice through tectonic processes. And now, this is very plausible, and it's statistically perhaps the most likely explanation. But there's also a hypothesis that argues that the rust color comes from biomolecules called tholins, which includes a wide range of simple organics like CO2, methane, and ethane. This is exciting if it's true, because these tholins are the precursors to biochemicals, and they're thought to have been involved in abiogenesis. So where we see tholins, we could see life. Or at least, we could see an environment that's potentially ready for life to emerge and spread. There are other aspects of the icy geography of the European crust, like depressions and pits in the ice, that suggest that there might even be smaller oceans or lakes that are fully encapsulated within the ice and separate from the deeper subsurface ocean. Confirmation of these ice-locked lakes will require more missions to the Jovian system, but if they do exist, these points of warmer water could be potential natural petri dishes for microecologies. If the available heat energy there can support microbial life, there could, theoretically, be small, simple communities of alien microbes floating around in these encapsulated bodies of water. And depending on how long they've been isolated from each other from the other similar bodies of water that are also encapsulated throughout the icy crust, the microbial life in proximal lakes could be quite distinct, if not an entirely different biochemical lineage right down to its genetic material. Before we get carried away, it's important to understand that this is all conjecture. The existence of these subsurface ice-encapsulated lakes hasn't even been proven yet, and considering how young the icy crust is, and how rapidly it gets recycled, it doesn't really seem likely that these hypothetical lakes would persist and be stable for evolutionary lengths of time. Any talk of alien microbes in these lakes is just wishful thinking. Now, the really exciting potential for life on Europa comes from its subsurface ocean, which is huge. There's two big reasons why this ocean could potentially host life. It's liquid water, which is always good for life, and Jupiter's gravity induces tidal forces on the moon, which bend and warp it and generate heat. So you have liquid water and heat right there, and potentially biochemical building blocks, which is all the things you really need to have life. But how plausible is life in the European Ocean, really? The ocean itself is generally cold, but it's also very large. It's estimated that there's between 2 and 3 times the volume of water on Europa as there is on Earth. So all of Earth's oceans, all of that water, everything in the Mediterranean Sea, everything in all the landlocked seas, everything in the rivers, that's half or a third of all of the water in Europa. So that should maybe give you a sense of scale of just how big this subsurface ocean is. You might think, hey, that's great. There's all this room for alien life to swim around, and that's awesome. But the truth is, it's actually not that great for life. On Earth, the open ocean is some of the most lifeless water that there is. Nutrient density is relatively high along the coasts and the seafloor, and along coral reefs, and it's extremely low in the open water, which discourages life from dwelling there. It wouldn't necessarily be a benefit for life to have a larger volume of water like this, if the life still has to concentrate along the ocean floor, where currents and water circulation will carry nutrients, and where sediment will accumulate. Despite the fact that the ocean is cold, tidal heating from Jupiter dumps a lot of thermal energy into the moon. These tidal forces can create Rossby waves, which are slow-moving but high kinetic energy, high-area waves that generate heat by burning off kinetic energy through friction. Tidal flexing warps the moon's core and induces geothermal activity that could produce undersea volcanoes and deep-sea hydrothermal vents. Deep-sea vents, I should add, are a suspected place for the origin of life on Earth, as they provided both a fertile mineral substrate and a perpetual stream of chemical and thermal energy. Studies suggest that the European Ocean interacts with the mineral seafloor, that minerals are being uptaken and circulated through the water, and that this could potentially be stable enough to feed an ecology of living organisms. Additionally, it's been proposed that the tectonic cycling of the icy crust could recycle oxygen and hydrogen peroxide back into the water. Oxygen would oxygenate the water, and hydrogen peroxide, when in contact with water, will just break down into oxygen and water. This will, naturally, oxygenate the water and make it more fertile for life. Here on Earth, oxygenated water is critical for life, and even small deviations out of the safe range of oxygen content can suffocate or poison a particular species of fish. Where there's little to no oxygen in the water, there's a dead zone, and life struggles to survive. Okay, so let's look at the list of Europa's qualities here. Europa has liquid water. The water is warmed by tidal forces from the gravitational influence of Jupiter. That's a pretty steady, reliable source of heat. It's also salty and rich with minerals and nutrients, and there's currents and cyclical patterns in the water flow that mix around these nutrients, and recycling of the surface ice could quite possibly mean that the ocean is well oxygenated. Every single one of these things is a strong marker for a biologically fertile environment. So where's the life? We have all of these indicators, all of these tantalizing hints pointing at where there might be life, but so far there's just no direct evidence. Perhaps there isn't any life on Europa. If that's the case, if it really is a dead planet with a sterile ocean, what could possibly be a limiting variable here that prevented life from forming? I think that the most likely possibility is that even though tidal heating induces heat, it just doesn't induce enough heat to really get the ball rolling. If there's no hydrothermal vents or something to provide that immediate source of heat and mineral substrates, well, it's going to be a lot harder for life to get started. If microbial life exists on Europa, but it's just too cold and there's not enough available energy, these microbes might never have the chance to evolve greater complexity and to produce a lineage of alien fish or something like that. Alternatively, there could be too many solutes in the water. It could just be way too salty for life. And if anything lives here at all, the only thing that it could be would be some kind of halophilic extremophile microbe. A number of missions have been planned to try and get inside the liquid water ocean itself and have a look around. Various ideas that have been floated include attempts to drill or melt through the ice, and then poke in a little sensor node or something to take a look around and get some readings of what it's like under the ice, and what the ocean's like, what you can see, if anything's swimming around down there, you know? One of the proposals that I think is the most plausible is a two-part mission that will drop a lander on the surface, and this lander will use a radioactive module, like a little sphere with a radioactive core inside of it, to melt through the ice. The radioactive core will generate heat, and so you just set it on the ice and it'll slowly melt through. Once it is through the ice shell, then the lander will be able to lower a submersible through the melt hole, and the submersible will then land in the liquid water ocean and swim around and study everything it finds. Naturally, there are some problems and complications and some serious risks with any of these approaches. A pretty basic mechanical issue is simply the depth of the ice. If the ice sheet is 100 kilometers thick, we're not going to be able to get through it. We're not going to get drilling equipment out there that could be able to dig that deep. A radioactive module could slowly melt through 100 kilometers of ice, but it's difficult to say if the crust would be stable enough for a small hole like that to stay open for that long. Maybe the ice would shift or something, or the pressure would force it back up, and who knows, there could be any number of variables that could just mess it up. But even if that goes by without a hitch, even if the radioactive module makes this perfectly clean hole through the ice, then who's to say that the lander would even be able to carry enough cable to lower the submersible all the way to the water? I mean, you could say, oh, just drop the submersible down the hole. But that would be risky, and it could rattle against the sides of the hole, and it could damage all the sensitive instruments on whatever, submersible you engineer to do this. Now, besides all of these basic mechanical engineering problems, the biggest issue is contamination. If we do try one of these lander-submersible combo missions, the machinery will have to be perfectly sterilized, or else we risk contaminating an entire moon with foreign biomatter, like a literal seed of alien microbes being dropped through the ice into their ocean. If contamination does occur, there's a few possible outcomes, depending on what the current situation is on Europa. In the first case, nothing could happen. The environment is just too hostile, and the Earth-based microbes die quickly. This would probably be the most ideal outcome in the case of contamination. We could learn from it, and it would also be quickly taken care of. We wouldn't necessarily know right away if it was immediately taken care of, but if we sent further missions and found out that it would be a good relief. Now, in the second situation, Europa could still be a lifeless world. There could be no native life at all, and Earth microbes could potentially thrive and then fill the waters of Europa. Now, this would be kinda cool, but kinda lame, but not that terrible. If we didn't kill any potential alien life, that's good, but we might get annoyed and confused when we find out that this newly discovered alien life was just the product of our own contamination from an earlier mission. That would be kind of embarrassing. Now, the third and worst case scenario would be if there is native alien life thriving in the European Ocean, and our biocontamination destabilizes it, or poisons it and destroys it, and kills most of the life there, or all of it. That would be a catastrophic and unacceptable loss of scientific knowledge and biological novelty. But there is a fourth and best case scenario. It's one that I dream about. And it's a case where we discover that the European oceans are rich with macroscopic life forms and complex ecologies. I can imagine alien analogs of fish and crustaceans and cephalopods, like the one in the movie Europa Report, all having evolved in this closed-off, dark, aquatic world. Because the icy shell on Europa blocks out the light from the sun, the ocean would be as dark as the deepest trenches of Earth's oceans. Photosynthetic life would not be feasible here, but chemotrophic life, like microbes that feed off of the sulfur compounds or the hydrogen coming out of a deep-sea vent, could be the primary producers of a larger, more complex trophic cascade. Assuming that there's enough geochemical and thermal energy to sustain it, you could have these chemotrophic microbes as primary producers, forming layers or films, like some kind of algae. Small secondary consumers, like tiny fish and crustaceans, could consume these algae-like microbes for food, and in turn, they would be the food for larger animals. There might be something like an alien shark, pale as milk and entirely blind, swimming in the ocean of Europa with its alien senses. And at this very moment, it's detected a prey animal and launches a sudden, fatal strike. Or maybe in these pitch-black oceans, biofluorescence is a really popular evolutionary adaptation, and the oceans are actually alive with alien colors, glowing and flickering in the darkness. An entirely separate, unique strain of life, a unique biochemical cascade, a novel evolutionary superreaction could be going on right now, right down the block from Earth, just past the asteroid belt. For now, this idea of a biodiverse Europa is just a dream from science fiction. But maybe one day, sometime in the future, explorers will be able to get their sensors and their robots beneath the ice to discover what really lurks in the dark depths of the oceans of Europa.